Welcome to the last voices of the season. Today we have Jason Frasca and Iain Kerr. What I like about the way they frame their work is that you're setting conditions for innovation to happen. And those of you who are familiar with how Prometheus thinks of leadership, the action of leading, some of that action is direct action, kind of conventional leadership. But a lot of it is setting conditions for others to take direct action. Making change is what leading is about. And it sounds like setting conditions for things to change and innovation is what Iain and Jason are talking about. So we're here to compare thoughts and learn about what the greater truth might be. And with that short introduction, I will turn it over to Jason. Introduce yourself and tell us about your Emergent Futures Lab.
Tom, thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation into your space. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jason Frasca, my partner, Kerr. We are co-founders of Emergent Futures Lab. We're also professors at Montclair State University. We co-direct our innovation research lab there. In addition, we have an innovation consultancy we call Emergent Futures Lab. And two questions drive all of our work at Emergent Futures Lab and the university. In all of our creative works, our book, our newsletter, our community is: what is innovation? And more importantly, how do you innovate? And so we've developed a framework and approach to innovate in a complex, dynamic, and emergent way. So the topic of today's presentation is: what is creativity and how should organizations prepare to innovate? What needs to happen before we begin? What are those conditions to allow creativity to succeed? So we're going to tackle this in two parts with discussion after each per the Voices format and that Tom has prescribed to us, which is great. Part one is the challenge of creativity. And we'd like to ground ourselves in the Oxford definition of creativity, which is the use of the imagination or original ideas, especially in the production of an artistic work. And we'd like to highlight and focus on some of those terms. Let's start with use. We are using something to produce something. And what we are using to produce something is the imagination or ideas, and that something should be original, which is to say new, unique, or different. And we'd like to unpack this a little bit. If we start with an idea or an image of what you want to happen, and it's meant to be unique, it's a type of projective process, right? You're projecting or casting this idea into the future. This is what you want to see happen. And then you work backwards to try to figure out how to make this idea or image real. It's a future backwards approach. This has an essence to it. This idea is your essence. The image is your essence. And within this future backwards approach happens to live also a linear approach. So what's the problem with a future backwards approach? While there is a problem with this approach, it does work for certain forms of creativity. And this is, important to see, note, and acknowledge, because creativity treats change as a linear process. Change is at the heart of creativity. The idea of doing something original, something new, it's changing from what we have now to something different, right? This type of change is an incremental change. And so we could call this type of change a change in degree. And by focusing on this linear and essentialist approach, we can see that it's comprised of linear, distinct logics and techniques. And the logics are focused on this idea of change in degree. They're incremental, they're developmental, they're world expanding, they're possibilistic. There's a continuity between the past, the present, and the future. And you can see this in the techniques that we've developed, such as the problem solution framework, where you can see there's a problem, you can see its limitations, and you can try to solve them. And a very simple example of that might be that this chair I'm sitting in hurts. I'll make it padded. I'll add some lumbar support. I'll change how my body sits in it. And this approach is seen in a number of really powerful techniques like design thinking, agile, business model canvas, product market fit. And these are all working through this idea where you develop an idea, you come up with a plan, and then begin by working towards realizing it. And because this style of developmental innovation has been around for so long, for over 100 years, we've constructed a unique set of logics, techniques, practices, environments, and sensibilities to meet this style of developmental innovation. And if we examine these techniques and their logic, we can see there are a number of practices that center ideation as the key practice. Idea management, predictive tools, iteration and prototyping, future backwards planning, concept-rich speculation, brainstorming, and ideation. And we've developed environments where these practices work, where knowledge-rich discussions can happen. Everything from how we work around the table, how we break out into teams, how we pitch ideas to one another, even how we vote on things. There's a sensibility to all of this. It's a future backwards concept that's abstract driven. It's disembodied, disembedded. Its idea driven sensibility often relates to things like mindsets and abstract spaces. All of this leads to linear methods. These techniques in ideation driven innovation, there's something that happens to trigger inspiration. And then you ideate, plan, and make. And we can see it very clearly here in the double diamond: discover, define, develop, deliver. Design thinking, same thing: empathize, ideate, prototype, and make. All of this conforms to an organizational logic, a top-down approach, right? From inside to outside. You have the C-suite plus management. You have HR, marketing, research and development, engineering, production, all discrete functional units, plus outside consultants. And this standard organizational process of making begins with step one, which is to ideate. Ideas are generated and approved. And this process typically includes the consultants and key people in the room, usually management, maybe people from marketing and some other people from the organization, and the ideas get generated, which leads us now to step two, which is to plan. Plans are developed and tested. We move deeper into the organization where the plans can be developed by the right people and teams, and they can be tested by engineering and R&D, and maybe marketing is running some studies alongside. Which leads us to step three, which is support. The plans are supported to move forward into the next phase, which is step four, which is to make. At this point, we start to make the thing. It's made on both the production side and on the advertising side. And then things leave the organization. Process is designed to flow efficiently through an organization with discrete units doing their own things. So what's the problem with this? There are two problems. The first is that you cannot ideate the new, which gets at something that we call the creativity paradox, where ideas, images, they're conservative. We can only ideate what we know, what we've seen, what we've been exposed to, heard, experienced, consumed. There's no language for the new. And so if we're really talking about something genuinely new, there won't be any language for it, and there certainly won't be any idea for it. The second problem with this is that reality is just not linear. And the future backwards logic has many dangerous assumptions in it that set it up to fail when reality isn't working in the specific manner that we hoped it would. And so the problem is that this linear and essentialist style does not reflect what actually happens. Linear styles are one step following another. It's the future backwards and overpinning. Essentialist styles, where the essence is in something, the essence drives the whole process and is trying to stay true to its values. But these styles don't reflect reality, which is far more complex and dynamic, self-organizing and highly contingent, and spontaneously creative. What's more important is that reality's complexity, dynamics, and emergent properties make it nearly impossible to work backwards with linear models. There are too many unknowns. emergent possibilities that are happening that will sweep things off course as you try to make them real. And so, because all human processes emerge from and rely upon dynamic, emergent, self-organizing, and feed-forward processes, the reason why a linear approach works is because without even realizing it, the linear approach is tapping into and relying upon dynamic, self-organizing, feed-forward processes of reality. Thus, while creative processes can appear to be linear, they are supported and co-created by a field of dynamic, nonlinear complexity. So the question we'd have here is, why aren't we working with these co-emergent processes? Why are we imagining that a model that doesn't fit reality works? And what should we be using? What would be a better approach? We really need to be involved in something like a more co-emergent process. And that's coming back to our creative paradox, that while change in degree represents some of what happens with change in creativity, there's a whole other area of change that exceeds this. And this radically different form of change is what we call a change in kind. A change in kind is something qualitatively new that emerges. You can't reduce it to the known. It's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't get there by making the other thing better or solving problems. It makes the problem of one model obsolete and irrelevant and does something entirely different. It's disruptive, it's discontinuity, it's making a different world, and it's strongly co-emergent. And so we need different set of techniques for all of this, which would be techniques of co-emergence, disclosure and blocking, threshold, experimenting, feed-forward assemblies, using exaptive possibilities, the unintended, co-opting the unintended, ecosystemic development, and much more. And so the linear techniques, the ones we've built out and designed our organizations around, will not help because they turn difference in kind into a difference in degree. They remove difference altogether. They block the possibility of radical difference from really emerging. And so the problem is that we've set up nearly every aspect of our worlds and our organizations to do one linear thing really well: developmental innovation. But we haven't figured out how to do this with a change in kind. And so as we're coming towards the end of part one, Iain, I've done a lot of talking. Do you have anything that you want to add before we get to the discussion of part one?
No, this was really great. I think it'll all come up in the discussion.
All right. Terrific. Then, Tom, we would turn it back to you here.
Yeah, so I am going to ask a clarifying question or two. Clarify for me what you mean by a change in kind again, because I'm not quite sure it's sticking for me.
Yeah. This is coming from a philosophy of creativity and innovation from early in the 20th century, Henri Bergson. And what he wanted to say was that there's two types of change, and change in degree is like quantitative change, like it's more or less something. You could have a car and now we've made it faster, slower. We've made it a pickup truck. These are all variations of the same underlying logic. So there's a continuity between all the forms of cars. So that's really the world of change in degree. And we live in that world most often, right? We live inside a world, a culture, and we're kind of expanding it, shifting it, moving things around. But this doesn't encompass all forms of change. And so the change in kind, which is a qualitative difference, it's one where you can't compare one thing to another. So like the classic example is like, you can't compare apples to oranges. They're qualitatively different. So the criteria of what makes a good apple, let's say, like it's crunchy, it's tart, you can't do that, more of that or less of that, and get an orange. And it's the same, you could say, You could try and solve horse-based transportation problems, like horses shit too much, they die, they need food. And so you could make a better horse, you could make a better cart, but you wouldn't get a car. That's a qualitatively different approach to mobility, transportation. It's moving from the world of animals and natural resources as forms of transportation to engines. So this is the basis of change in degree and change in kind. And, once you're talking about something that's new and discontinuous, you can't, as Jason was saying, you can't ideate it. Our words and concepts relate to variations of what exists. So there's no direct path from your idea to the qualitatively new.
Yeah. So I'm just asking for clarification.
Yep.
There's a relationship, it seems to me, to changes in kind within a paradigm or tautology versus going beyond that with a paradigm shift or breaking the tautology. Do you think in those terms? Can you have a change in kind within a paradigm?
No, I mean, I think this is a useful, so you're totally right, like that, what is often called like a paradigm change would be a large scale change in kind, qualitative shift, so shifting, to a new model of what it means to be a human that emerges, say, with the 1700s in Europe. That's a qualitative change. But I think it's really important, and the power of looking at things this way is that you can find qualitative change at many scales, right? So you could think of chairs are, in the most general sense, addressing questions of like, how do we support the body and repose? There's other qualitatively distinct ways you could approach it rather than the chair answer, which is like, support the muscular skeletal system from below and from behind. So I think the important thing is not to just see it like only if we're talking about paradigms, but qualitative change and change in kind, we can find at multiple scales. And they always face, I'd say, the same problem as you can't ideate.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, normally we have a bigger crowd and we break up into small groups. Now we have a pretty small group, and I think we can have a great discussion just amongst ourselves. What questions come up for you when you hear these ideas? What do you think the challenges are, either that you face or that your organizations face or that show up in your context? Greg Spencer, welcome.
Yeah, you've taken me back to a conversation I was having last week in London about sports coaching. And a generation ago, we had the conditions for innovation all over the world of sports coaching because it was mostly amateur. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry had their own pet theories about what might work. And everybody was free to experiment and try different things because nobody really believed anybody had the answers. And it was a very innovative landscape. And then all of a sudden, I think rugby union was probably to the forefront of professionalization, and you end up with a big centralized program. And everybody starts getting more professional and having a job that depends on having the right answer. And we went down a pathway that led to marginal gains and all the other buzzwords as everybody tried to bring more and more disciplinary specialists into incremental change in a model. So we've already decided what it takes to win, and we're just going to get better at it. And then that whole model got extrapolated across the whole of British high performance sport in the build up to the London 2012 Olympics. If you wanted public funding, then you needed to play the game. There were performance directors that would build your incremental change around scientific input from the English Institute of Sport. And everybody was expected to go down the centralized programming. And it feels to me as if the space for innovation has pretty much evaporated. If you're actually going to get any innovation in our space now, it needs to be from a disruption that's probably going to come from outside of British sporting circles. It's more likely to come from another country. Does that pretty well capture where you were driving at here?
It captures part of it, and it definitely captures the kind of the cultural logics that often happen where we have these moments where there's a lot of experimentation possibility, but there's not a lot of, what we would call overcoding. There's not like a system that's been imposed and starting to organize things. And it allows that diversity and this kind of thicket of things to let something emerge. And then it stabilizes through various things. I think the challenge is, how do we bend organizations back towards an emergent model that could let something new happen? But I think a really big part of what we wanted to foreground here was that.
Yeah. So I wonder what the relationship these ideas will be to one that we've been playing with around in another session called Warmer Voices, which is a warm data session. Because here's how I think about it. I think there's conscious, are the structural language and ideas that we're already working in, which could be quantitative change. Then there's the liminal, which is kind of maybe more the emotional, the intuitive piece, and then the subliminal, which is, really fundamentally human, kind of archetypal sense. And so the Warmer Voices sessions are meant to use stories and listening to open us to what's outside of our structural thinking, but is resonant in people's experience. So hoping to open us up into the liminal and the subliminal type of space so that we can rebuild ideas, ideate from a different place, is how I think about it practically. Do you have the same type of discovery, or is there any of this element in what you do?
So the approach is both right and highly difficult, which is to say, like, we're going to have to rely on hunches, like things that are emerging, and we have a sense this might lead us experimentally somewhere else. So let's try it out. But here's the problem, and the big challenge is that we know from ecological psychology and from enactive cognition that what we feel and see is because of our embodied practices in the environments we have. So just so if we all got together and did a warm data type thing to sense what maybe through storytelling is different, we would be back in the same loop because we're not enacting different environments, experiments, and conditions, which would lead us to sense, feel, and think differently. And I think this is the real challenge, that we can't, if we just jump to something like warm data, which is a wonderful thing, and long form storytelling, we're still in the same spot without changing the habits and practices, like how we're embodied, embedded, extended, and our deeper level of participatory sense making. And this is why I think, Greg, things often come from elsewhere. So you could imagine a new sport emerges. So there's now a new affordance landscape, of like embodied possibility through action, and new concepts emerge from that. And then you start to see the connection. But it's because people are doing things differently with different tools and in different environments that we can then get to the kind of warm data thing. But if you don't pair the two, we're all going to have a kind of shared landscape of intuitions, or more likely.
Yeah. So let me just ask another clarifying question. This embodied experience, when I think of that, I think we've got to go out and be somewhere different or do something different so that we make different sense. A warm data experience doesn't actually get us into that other environment. However, I'm not defending it. I'm just saying in between those two extremes, there's our imagination of what we might imagine those other things are, which might not be sufficient to break us through, but still gets us there. And there's the tapping of the experience of others that are different than ourselves, who actually are present in the conversation, right? So if you have a group together doing some more data experience and you're all from the same product team, you're not going to get any different embodied experience. But if you get, customers and children and school teachers and scientists into that discussion, you ought to get different embodied experience opened up. And again, I'm actually buying into this embodied experience thing. I'm just wondering if there's this continuum of stuff to harvest.
This is these are real, living questions for us, because they're very difficult. So we'll do these all day or couple day workshops that are highly embodied, engaged with materials and doing, and people will have a non-ideational, qualitatively emergent, team-based, process-based newness will show up. And everybody will be, at the end, you can ask everybody, could you have predicted any of the outcomes that happened today in any way, shape, or form? And 99% will be no. And did anybody ideate any part of this? No, it was all emergent through a process. But then we'll ask people, let's now diagram the process as you experienced it. What happened? And people will literally fall back into the language concepts, but the intuitions, the experiential embodied intuitions of ideating, planning, testing, and then making. We have to sit down with them and we have to do this whole, so you say this, but point me to that experience. And it takes another day and many iterations to get people to move from having an experience to be able to see that they had it and not see it as something else. And I think this is a really big part of the challenge, is that, we have experiences all the time, but there's a kind of path dependency to it, right? And there's a concept dependency, and there's a affordance dependency, and whatever it might be, so that we see things as the things we know. And so early on, this is now a few years ago, we thought we'd come up with the most genius emergent workshop to give people this experience. And all they had to do is have the experience. And then we'd be like, woohoo, our work's done. We can go to the bar. And and people will now be able to translate this into whatever they're working on, their sports coaching, their something. But it's just not the case, right? And that second part of getting people to connect with an experience as the experience is really profoundly challenging. And it's part of being human. How we make sense of things is that we, just like you were saying, Tom, we've already pre-made sense of them. It's like a gestalt. We know it and feel it. It's not something we're in any way conscious of. But we have to get people to be good at this reinscription. And that's a huge challenge in all of this.
Dave Fearon, I think you've got a question right on the tip.
I do, but sometimes my questions feel like I'm lobbing a giant fish into the room. Plop. First impression, as I was thinking at this moment, is finally I'm hearing about work that you two guys are doing that is fundamentally different than the basis of artificial intelligence. To me, artificial intelligence is totally based on what you described, Jason, up front. Everything is known. It's just a matter of picking out what's known and reassembling it in new ways. I'm excited to hear about your work because, and I think Tom shares this because we've both been collaborating here and there. How do we break out and find human at its most yeasty and free expression? Below the artist, below the scientist. But it's at that point that I think something breaks out. It is really a change of kind.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear the part you're absolutely right, with large language models are statistical token-based prediction systems. They're doing exactly what Jason was saying. Like, they're taking knowledge and incrementally moving it in new patterns, but that's all change in degree. But what they can't do, like ontologically, they can't do is do something qualitatively new. It's really important to see that it's not just humans that do the qualitatively new, but all of reality does this, right? Like the Big Bang is a qualitatively new becoming of the universal proportions. And these are all like self-organizing material systems, self-organizing living systems also lead to the qualitatively new. Like we see it with evolution, dinosaurs becoming birds, mushrooms becoming animals, whatever it might be. And that part of what makes us creative or any intentional being is how we connect to these ongoing complex systems of possibility. I would say the part of being human in creative practices that allows for real difference is also part of how we connect with the world differently, right? Rather than like, say, imposing a vision on it and being like, I'm going to shape it to my whatever, like, how do I follow it? How do I co-evolve with it? How do I bend it, notice it? And so I think a lot of the ways to get out of, you could say, that the limits of things like AI are these experimental engagements with doing things.
Yeah,
like if we get Greg to invent a new sport with us that, and we just like we look at what most sports are like. This is a kind of way we often work. What's the underlying logic to something? Let's block it. We won't do it. I guess let's pretend we're working with field sports, but we won't have a field in the normal way. We won't have two teams. We'll do something else. So that's just like the initial conditions. And now we're going to all experiment and things will emerge, relationally in dynamics, and then we can test and follow, and maybe then we start to notice that some of this is happening in other creatures. We could take something from how bacteria is doing something, and we're following exaptations, like we're co-opting things to do something new with it, and we're on and on. But so I think the important part is it's like, if we get too hung up on the humanistic part, like it's just, we could miss that the human creativity is a worldly experimental one in a world. And I think this was like a big part of what Jason was saying. Like, we live in a world that's astonishingly dynamic and creative, and our types of creativity surf those in some way. And I think, Greg, correct me if I'm not wrong, you're like involved in like water sports, like passionately, like whitewater kayaking kind of thing. Like these are all experiments in that, right? Like where, like you're probing a dynamic system, like playing with buoyancy and trajectory and what happens if. And then, well, let's change the shape of the boat. Let's change the shape of the paddle. Let's change entry angle. And some collaboration co-emerges with the system. And you're like, holy shit, I didn't die. This is interesting. And then you try and stabilize it, in some way. And then you call it something and you come up with concepts. And maybe it's radical enough that it comes up with a new approach to being in a water body, right? I don't know whitewater kayaking well enough, but there's stylistic, qualitative emergences that happen in these things. If there was one last thing I'd want to say, kids, babies might do this really well, but the problem is, and babies don't understand what exists and what could be qualitatively different. So I think both the challenge and the reality is like, the great part is like, we can look at things and we're like, okay, that's the system. Let's not do it. But when you're very young and you're being creative, you're just mixing things and hybridizing. I shouldn't say just, but you're not having the same kind of realization like, holy shit, this is qualitatively different. And that requires being able to recognize and disclose difference. You're like, this isn't that. And I think learning to see that type of difference is a really important skill to teach. And part of that's like a knowledge-based skill where, and this is again about bringing people into the room and from very different things. Like somebody will be able to say like, no, you think that's new, but that's just a variation of this way of whitewater kayaking. And then you're like, okay, great, we could go further. Like now we see the space of that. And I think this is a really important part of we're not trying to be childlike in creativity, but we are trying to have that curiosity of like what will happen if that you find in kids. Because they don't know that if they step off the cliff, maybe they're going to die. So they'll step off more cliffs. We can just do it where we're poking at the edges of thresholds where we think a threshold might be. And we can then kind of co-make that threshold. And suddenly we notice like, no, we're no longer kayaking. We're no longer this. We're doing something new.
That's cool.
Yeah. And it links to that whole abductive reasoning thing of repurposing things. One of the classic examples would be in rock climbing, when you take away an affordance that everybody else just thinks is essential. In rock climbing, bigger, taller men had a lot of reach. All of a sudden, we got a shorter athlete. 30 years ago, Johnny Dawes comes along and he can't do what they can do. And having taken away the thing that everybody has said you need, one option is to say, well, that just means I can't do it. But he wanted to do it anyway. And all of a sudden, we have silly routes where you've got to make 3 dynamic routes moves in a row. And there's no way you can pause in between. And it's a revolution in how some people approach climbing. And once somebody's done one, the floodgates open. All of a sudden, the world was different. It's that style of creative innovation that I think you're pushing for here, isn't it?
I love the rock climbing examples, because I wasted most of my life rock climbing in the best sense of wasting it. So it's very familiar. I would be cautious, like the idea of abductive reasoning, which is like bringing two things that don't go together. That's lovely, but it's what we're really talking about is types of experiments, like embodied experiments, where making is thinking and making's leading to thinking. And like the abductive part could look like, if you just pull it out of the process, it just looks like sophisticated brainstorming. And then people fall back into this. We just need, more abductive people in the room, and we would have these greater ideas. But that's just not the case. It's that people, in the rock climbing sense, it could be that Johnny Dawes is a bit smaller, that somebody else is different, that this rock is different, but it's an engaged experiment that's leading, that's pulling you in, that's leading you to feel, sense, see, think different. And then the concepts are merging and you're connecting them to other concepts. So the abductive is great, but it's only great if it's not back in the boardroom. We've picked out this concept like a silver bullet, and we're like, stop induction, stop deduction, do this, and we'll get that. And the reason this is back to what Jason was saying, like the reason we like that is because it sounds like the things we already know. So we're like comfortable, and we're like, great, we can do that. Thomas.
Yeah, I have 3 things I'm going to try to intersect here. One is, as I'm listening, I'm asking myself, the wrong thing to do is to worry about whether or not you're innovating in kind while you're trying to innovate. I'm speculating, because then you're locked into, am I doing it right in your head, and trying to be different. You might look at that retrospectively. So that's one thought. The other thought is Robert Fritz. I don't know if you guys like or have read Robert Fritz's stuff on creating. He's been a guest here a couple times. His point is in the creative process as opposed to the innovative process. I'll get back to the third piece in a minute, is that you start with nothing. You get rid of concepts. You're really creating something from your present experience. So that's the creative piece, maybe not the innovative piece. And then I think, well, so if you're creating in a new space, in a new context, you're really responding to the world that you're in. If you're in a new space or you've got a difference or a new problem that you're dealing with, you're not thinking about, can I innovate in kind? You're thinking about just processing what you want from that space that you're in. And then maybe something new emerges because you're in a different space, not because you're trying to create something new. Excuse my blabbering. Does any of this make sense to you?
Yeah, it totally does. I think I would say you need to have a sense. The important thing is you need to have a sense that there is a difference between change in degree and change in kind, and that it's not like you're saying this is where we want to go, and you have some kind of fixed thing, but you have to have a sense that you want to co-emerge in a way that leads you beyond just a change in degree as an end. So you've shifted the horizon. Like you've said, we want to go somewhere else. That's qualitative. The important part is you're only going to get there through many cycles of experimentation. And this is, I think, a part that people miss with, say, the exaptation story of dinosaurs to birds. It's not like there was some kind of mutation. Dinosaurs had feathers and the feathers made them sexy or made them warm. And then some dinosaur who by chance had a bit more feathers than another falls off a tree or a cliff and starts gliding. Like it's not happening in one go. But what you're seeing is that cycle by cycle, the dinosaurs are varying. So the first little feathers are keeping them warm. Then they're holding pigment and making them look sexy. The feathers are getting big. Sexy feathers make you also look scarier, or if somebody bites you, they only get a mouthful of feathers. So then you have more variations that are both scary and feathers falling off. Those then help you do something else like keep eggs warm. And then you get thicker feathers, and you get the feathers that start to interlock. And then the environment around you is changing. So it's no longer just giant mushrooms, but trees and mammals are emerging. You have to run up trees. The flapping thing helps you push your legs in. So now you get really good at tree running. But if you think of these are all just improvements on dinosaur success in dinosaur world. But at some point, they start to co-emerge a threshold of difference. So dinosaur gets up to the top of the tree and falls off, and some of them don't die because they tumble in a way that slows them down. And that leads to variations that allow parachuting and variations that might allow gliding. But that's inventing a threshold and crossing it at the same time. But all the way, the dinosaur just wanted to be a better dinosaur, right? So that's the sense, Tom, I think that you're saying, you're not trying to disrupt the world, but at the same time, I think in a human intentional way you are, because you're not stopping after one iteration, and you're not just saying because you could be hey, we invented sexiness, we can market that and sell it, but it's no, we're going to keep going. And then you invent egg warming, and you're we could make lots of money there, but it's and I think this is the part in a lot of innovation models is there's no cycling, right? It's ideate, plan, make, and then design thinking, we add prototyping, but that's just to improve the product. It's not to nobody's going hey, we made a product, let's go beyond it. It's no, we got the product, woohoo, we're done. And I think that's the challenge here. Part 2. All right. So part 2, organizations, structural propensities, and the 2 creativities. So we want to go back to our lovely little definition just to ground ourselves and then take it in a new direction. So we have this definition, the use of the imagination, original ideas, especially to produce, something new in artistic spaces, original. So if we dig into this, Now back into these background assumptions. There's a series of really important ones here. We're imagining these 5 things, and some we already talked about and some we haven't, that creativity is human, and that more than just human, it's individual. We've already talked about how it's ideational and immaterial. It doesn't have a physicality to it when it happens. There's an essence and a linear process. We want to start to challenge these and push on them, because once you go from human to individual and there's an essence and it's an immaterial thing, there's a propensity to go in a certain direction. Jason.
All right. So Iain set it up. A beautiful question. If creativity is human, individually centered, with some essence, where is creativity? And so this might seem like an odd question, but we think it's fundamental because the assumption behind creativity is it's in the individual. It's why we have intelligence quotient tests and creativity quotients, right? And we try to discern if people are more or less creative. And we even try to find regions in the brain that have creativity. But is creativity in your brain? We would argue that this is the entirely wrong way to go about this, to ask if creativity is in your brain. It's to miss what's actually happening. So we'd like to ask another question. Where is flight? Is it in the wing? Is it in the feather? We'd say good luck finding flight in either the feather or the wing. Flight's in neither of them by themselves. Neither can fly. Flight requires many things: a body, muscles, skeleton, the cognitive ability to regulate all of the functions. But you can't stop there. The reason a bird can fly is because there's an atmosphere, right? There's a certain thickness to it. How do we get atmosphere? Well, there's humidity and there's wind currents, and winds are generated by the sun heating up different parts of the earth, which are causing wind, which are then hitting other parts of the earth and reshaping the earth and disrupting and changing the winds, right? And all of these things are working together in concert. And we would say flight isn't in anything. It's not the property of one thing, and there's no essence to it. It's the property of the system. And of course, you do need the bird for flight, and the feathers and the wings, and you need the bird and even the bird's brain, right? But none will achieve flight on their own. And so it's this relational emergent property of the system. Flight cannot be reduced to any one part of it, right? There's one set of parts. Can't be reduced to any one set of parts. And so this is also true of creativity. Creativity, like flight, emerges from the middle of an ecosystem. You're not going to find creativity in anything. And this whole in something direction, which is pervasive, will never help us get to creativity. And now that's not to say that the parts don't matter, they do, but how they matter is relational in an emergent reality. And so this is why when someone says, I'm not creative, or someone says, I'm super creative, neither are important. It turns out that the idea of traits, personality traits, which are used by more than 85% of all Fortune 500 companies to figure out who should do what, it turns out to have almost no real explanatory power because of this relational emergent logic. And so there are countless studies on all of this. In psychology, this is called fundamental attribution error. But what we really need to be paying attention to is relational things, especially how humans interact, plus environments and practices. And so rather than focus on what might be inside individuals, we need to pay attention to the relational dynamics of the environment and the tools and the practices. All right, Iain, back to you.
So luckily, there's a whole set of emerging fields that look at this. So the first really important one here, I think, that offers us a lot of power to rethink things is enactive cognition. And the study of the approach to cognition, of enactive cognition, is to look at how cognition is not the product of the brain alone, but it's a relational thing that emerges from what they say is like 4EA, from how we're embodied. The embodied part is like not just having a certain type of body, but how that body has been trained and shaped by practices, how we're embedded in environments, physical environments, and we're also embedded in rituals, practices, and techniques, and how we're extended by tools. A really simple example of how we're extended would be, nobody under the age of 20 knows more than, say, one phone number, because our memory has been extended into the smartphone. And I think for a lot of us now, we don't even think in terms of phone numbers whatsoever. So it's reshaping how we think and feel. So tools are extending us, and as they do, they're changing us. And so that we can move away from this brain-based idea of cognition to a relational one. And I think the next really important part here is that thinking is actually sense-making. And it's participatory. You're participating with others always. There's no thinking alone ever. Even when you're alone, it's a participatory model. But we can then start to make this more ecological. So looking towards ecological psychology and social psychology. And the fundamental attribution error is to attribute to the human individual what should be attributed essentially to the assemblage. We're saying Iain is so smart when we should be saying in this participatory assemblage, these features emerge, called Iain being smart or dumb. And so we have to start looking at assemblages. It's another fancy word for like a network, but we're thinking of networks aren't just people, but they're the tools we're using, the environments we're in, and that these are what are called relation dominant networks. So the relation is what's making the network. You can think of things like love as a relational property. It's not in, me or you, it's between us. It's held between us and it's shaping us. And this leads to a really fundamental thing from ecological psychology, that what we experience as reality is neither subjective, just all in our head kind of, or objective, just atoms out there. We experience reality as what it affords us because of who we are in the environment. So what we see are affordances. And this is like at a direct felt level, right? And this comes back to why it's so hard when we have an experience to actually see it as what it is, because we've been so co-shaped by our environment. So let's make this really concrete in an organizational sense. If you just take a chair, like a banal, boring chair, it turns out that there was this wonderful set of studies that have been done on judges. Now, judges, we want to understand here, are highly skilled people to make rational judgments based on all sorts of data. If you change the hardness or softness of the chair in a context where they're talking about the hardness or leniency of judgment, it will actually change how they feel about their judgments, the people they're judging. And so the softer chair participates in an emergent quality of a more lenient judgment. So this isn't theoretical. This isn't like hyperconceptual. This is shaping us directly and immediately, tacitly in everyday things. So how we're embodied and how we're extended is what we're seeing, feeling, doing. So this super simple example. So the really important thing to see is that the environment co-creates both our world and what it affords us. And now we can start to think, well, what's the environment of an organization? And if you think of, and this might be a little bit cliche, but when we think of the environment and how it co-shapes us, a lot of the environments that we're doing the thing called creativity is something like meeting rooms, boardrooms, breakout rooms. We've got easels and with paper and sticky notes. And the propensity and what it affords us is co-shaping us into this kind of ideational logic. So even if we don't know that creativity is about ideas and the imagination, developing plans and then making it, this is our experiential reality. We're co-shaped by this world. And so we like to say, and this is coming back to the introduction at the very beginning, that the configuration is configuring us. And you could put it in a nutshell. Once a set of conditions is met by configuration, a set of processes spontaneously begins to come into being via exploratory action. So we start to do things, but because it's in these environments that condition in a certain way, certain outcomes, the propensities are already there. And so as we begin, so shall we go, is Whitehead's famous saying. And we see this in, what's understood as path dependency. We've built these habits, practices, rituals, and systems, and everything's building in what's already there. And so even if we change the topic, or if we say we want to be qualitatively creative, when we're in this path dependency, we tend to keep going in the same way. But this isn't the end of it. What's really happening in these contexts is something called the ratchet effect. And if you think about a ratchet gear, it's where any agitation that happens to a system, it only moves in one direction. This is something developed in evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory a lot, but we also see it playing out in how we understand systems. So if you think about the American political system, you have a two-party system where one party is really invested in being in the middle and finding middle ground. And to do that, it's always avoiding moving further to the left. So it always cuts off that direction and tries to find the middle. The other party on the right is always trying to move to whatever it thinks its truth is, which will always be more to the right. So then the party on the left is trying to find the new middle. And so whatever the suggestion or whatever comes into this system, once it's set up that way, it will always move to the right. Not always, but more likely than not. And if you think of the ratchet effect in organizations, we've set up environments, tools, practices, techniques, habits, concepts, such that whatever comes in, it gets turned into this linear process. It's felt, seen, experienced, known, and intuited in this way. And that's part of what we were already talking about. And so here's the really, I think, important question in terms of leadership. What is leadership when the system always already leads in the sense of propensities? Like, what does a leader do? What do many leaders do in different parts of an organization? And I think this is especially true when they don't understand that the configuration is already configuring what's the emergent space of possibility and propensity. So this is like a huge question. And I think it's also a question of where should we work? It's in the context of where we're assuming creativity is all about ideas, right? And so we're assuming the wrong thing. We're missing this second type of creativity, the qualitative creativity. And we can't get to the new, the disruptively new, through that, right? So organizationally, we need configurations that allow for experimental co-emergence, right? And these will need both new processes and new environments. So we want to explore some of those a little bit. So we could go to the next slide. And just to stress what the problem is, we're trying to be qualitatively creative with the wrong methods. These linear ones, the double diamond, design thinking, in systems, environments that spontaneously move towards radically different propensities, which is, say, these linear propensities. And we don't recognize that this is a problem. So we like to say that we need a new mission. And the mission, if we're interested in creativity, isn't to jump into let's be creative. It's like, let's create an organizational infrastructure so that both creativities, the creativity of change in degree and change in kind, can spontaneously emerge. And we have organizations where just change in kind, change in degree will spontaneously emerge, right? So what organizations need to do is they need to develop a type of capacity building that's focused on the ecological and the enactive, like new ways of doing in new environments. And the challenge is that we can't begin from scratch. So we have to take advantage of what is already happening. So a couple suggestions. If we start with what we're embedded in, and we think first of the organizational environment and then the physical one. With the organizational environment, Jason, this is what we classically think of this logic as being, this kind of top-down, from inside to outside, discrete functional units. And we have a logic, if we go back one slide, the really important part of this is that we think of different activities happening in different units, in different departments. There is a department that handles HR. There's a department that does marketing. There's a department that does production. So if that's what we're doing, go to them. Now, there's early work by Robert Cooper, and he's in the management organizational space, really interesting figure in moving this. He says, to conceptualize generic organizations, like what's an organization in general, requires that we relax the requirements for specific locatable things that have specific functional roles, which is to say we can't think HR does HR, production does production anymore. Instead, we should think of organizations as loose and active assemblages of organizing, not static structures, but dynamic acts that are always on the move. And I think by shifting to this, sensing this, and figuring out how this actually is happening is where we begin to move the needle. So we're moving from different activities equal different departments to different activities are done by the same units in different configurational relations. So what you really see when you look at how anything happens in an organization is there's a much more informal structure that's allowing things to happen. There's a much more porous border between the inside and outside. So whatever you're doing, you're probably bringing in, through necessity, outside organizations, outside individuals, and they're linking across different silos and groups to make something happen. So at any one moment, if you were to freeze an organization, look what's happening, it would look much more like this. And if we go to the next slide, and then when you think of what somebody's doing in any given day, you can see that they're participating in these different assemblages. So, Jason is going to, after this talk, is going to lead a discussion on AI at the university. So wearing a totally different hat, connecting with totally different people inside and outside the organization, across many different departments. And then he's going to an activity to be doing something entirely different with different skills, different people. And this is what you really see happening all the time. And I think this is something that's really critical for creativity, because we don't know who should be part of a team to start with till we start going. And then we start an experiment and we bring people in from inside and outside because of one set of skills. As things emerge and develop, because we're probing and doing things, we realize that different skills, different aspects of people in different contexts need to happen. So I think one of the really important things is we need to make different ways we organize how work is assigned and how HR works in general. Because if you can't change what you're doing, nothing can genuinely emerge. So if Jason's entire day is called for to do X, Y, and Z, how could he ever participate in something that emerges, that then starts to take time? So we have to have ways of offloading work and having these dynamic teams where things can happen. I think what's good here is we see the resiliency movement in organizations participating in this, where you can't have everyone overworked all the time. So it's really important, I think, ironically, if you ask what could a leader do, is reconfigure how people do what they do such that they're not actually working at full capacity and that any one person's job can be done by many people, so jobs can move around separately from individuals. And then this leads to, I think, another really important insight that relates to the exact same logic. So how cultural change disseminates in organizations and more broadly is through what are called small world networks. And most things show a small world network model as part of it. And this is where there's many distinct, tightly connected regions, like all of these circles. And there's a few critical connections between them. And those connections are people. And when cultural change starts to happen, it's the network of trust that's moving the new across it. And in organizations, these aren't necessarily the glamorous people. Like, so if you want change to happen, bringing in the creatives to participate in a workshop won't help you get these practices to an organization. If you were to do a survey in some type of informal way and ask everybody, who do you go to when you have this type of problem? Who do you go to for that kind of advice? You would find the network of trust. And these are the people that bring change in. So when we're talking about cultural change, change of new habits, practices, techniques, and environments, they really should parallel networks of trust. So now let's talk about how we think about the temporal process of creativity. So we often, and this is like coming from things like the double diamond, we imagine that there's like early practices and they converge on something like an idea, a process, and then that gets stabilized and then it radiates out again, right? And it could be a person, it could be a team. So this is, for example, how we talk about the Wright brothers. So the Wright brothers brought together a whole bunch of things. They were the first to fly. This got stabilized into airplanes and then it radiated out. And now we have a universe of flight. Again, this is like participating in that fundamental attribution error where we're not really seeing what the system looks like. What we see actually happening is that there's a much more diverse set of things at the beginning. It's never coalescing on one thing, but it's building up an ecosystemic thicket, right? And so if you think about the Wright brothers brought some things together, many other pioneers around the world in flight brought things together in different small assemblages. They're all interwoven. The Wright brothers were the first to fly, but within 10 years, they actually left the business of flight because their whole wing warping model couldn't scale. So things didn't really emerge from them. People took parts of their ideas, they joined them to other ideas, and none of these failures were dead ends, but they made these transversal contributions. And one ecosystem led to the next, right? So we have to move to this much more distributed way of thinking also of how do we have many teams inside and outside an organization that can work in semi-autonomous ways, and they have the autonomy and agency to make new tools, make new spaces, make new connections, and do all of these things. So I think this is a really important part, and that underlying all of this should be a type of commoning approach. And this is coming from the social sciences, where the more something is owned by somebody around innovation, like this team owns that idea, the harder it is for this type of thicket to ever emerge. You need a lot of horizontal mobility where somebody can see what somebody else is doing and co-opt part of it, either for what it is or for something else. And this is a really critical part. So putting in feedback loops that allow for horizontal and unintended movement of emerging concepts and practices is really critical. Then we've already been talking about this. The big part of the answer to the creativity paradox, the idea that you can't ideate into the qualitatively new, is that you can get there experimentally by co-opting things for unintended purposes. Like in a sophisticated cyclical model, it's not a one and done. And, the classic examples of this people use, for better or for worse, the microwave, Viagra, Velcro, hip hop. I think flight, the Wright brothers famously figured out how to turn a box kite into wing warping because one of the Wright brothers was playing with a little box that you got inner tubes in. So just playing with that box got him to think of this. So exaptations are everywhere. So the importance part of the exaptation, it's an actual experimental physical doing with things. It's not ideation driven. It's not just about the ideas. And once we start to move in these directions, we have something like organizational innovation. We have this relational dynamics that could get us to innovation. So it's important to say, and if we wanted to be really strong about it, we'd say it's not about changing culture. It's not about education. It's not about mindsets, but it's not just about those things. Those things are relevant if you're doing the other things. But if all you're doing is changing a culture, adding education, shifting mindsets, the propensity, these ratchet effects will just still be in place. So it's really about shifting from focusing on the individual, and falling into this fundamental attribution error logic and moving to the ecosystem. So we got that. So this is like putting it in a nutshell. All of those things could change, mindsets and education. But if we don't change the practices, tools, environments, and team logics and redistribute agency so people could actively follow emergent relational novelty, we're back to where we've always been. Innovation's got to be this emergent ecosystemic question for organizations and for leaders. And this is a profound, paradigmatic shift. If you want to take a picture of this, we write a weekly newsletter. We're always going deeper into these things. And so you might enjoy that if you don't already read it.
The bit that I keep coming back to is getting distributed things in parallel, how we can connect more of the parts and make sure more of the parts are connecting in ways that we didn't plan. Strikes me as absolutely key. They're the sort of things we can do. I mean, ultimately, it comes catalyzing things that look as if they're entangling people, and to be bold about catalyzing those connections, and then not just the connections that are managed by the people who are happy making connections. That tends to be the people in the middle. It's the people who are hesitant about making connections that are where the gains are going to come. It's those youngsters that aren't really seeing where they fit in or how their voice is going to be heard.
But like departments and units, they're really good. They do good things, like they allow things to effectively happen. And they also allow a lot of tacit know-how to be passed on. If you're in the engineering department, it takes a lot of time to get those tacit skills, or in any department, right? And there's a culture and a ritual and practices. And so they're really good. I think that the challenge is really about getting people to notice, first of all, how much horizontality happens. So we work at a university, it's got huge units like arts, sciences, business, and it, you could think if you just went to the formal meetings that nobody talks to anybody outside of it. But that's not at all the case. And I think this is where I think organizations that do mapping and supporting of those networks, and, if people are working at full capacity, none of these things can happen. And a huge part is just to have more redundancy. And the most creative moments, like for Jason and I working at the university, they're really when we literally aren't like running on a hamster wheel to do everything in a day. And and then there's a few other contributing factors, but the fundamental one that is allowing this like play of space and experimentation is that people are not at capacity. And I think there's a whole hyper rationalization of organizations where it's like you want to be as efficient as possible. You want to, in a kind of quarterly report way, show that have improved the bottom line. The easy way to improve the bottom line is have fewer people and getting the people you have to be more efficient. But that drive to efficiency is what is always slowly trimming the horizontal. And, and then you're just like, hey, the creatives should be creative, those people. And then you just back to this linear ratchet of the ideational process, because that's the only thing that could happen. Because let's just imagine like Greg, Jason, and I, we happen to run into each other and we have this really crazy experimental thought. And we're like, Dave, we need you because you have the skill. And Dave's like, I love this. This is the best thing ever. I used to do this 10 years ago, but I have 4 deadlines this week. How about we do it next month? And then I'm going to suggest, like, why don't we just like write a short white paper on this and see if people are interested? And now that it's the ratchet effect, it's moved into the ideational knowledge economy, and it's going to become a pitch.
Yeah.
Maybe something happens, maybe something doesn't, but it never goes into this emergent systemic space.
I just throw in a personal experience. After 55 years in various roles in colleges and universities, mainly teaching.
Yeah.
I retired 10 years ago. And then so there's been a period of time when I say, wait a minute, I'm still a teacher, because that's my nature. So I've coined my description as a free range teacher.
Yeah.
Now it gives me more purpose in everyday experience, because as I'm out and about, and in this session today, I'm making ideas in my head. I'm thinking, oh, I should share this video with my son, who's very interested in inaction and research. And so I'm doing all these things in my head, and then I'll go out and I'll observe real behavior in a grocery store, and that'll make a connection.
Yeah.
How do we institutionalize that? We can say people have 2 roles. One, you must do your due, because that's what the students are paying for, all that. But we're going to give you a second role, which is completely free range. You're out of the cage. There's plenty of nutrients out there. And if you're not able to tell us in an accountable way how you've used that free time, free to range, not just free to chill, then you're not helping the institution with our innovation. And where I had the best results in the 30 years of my last stint at a public university was because I was on a lot of committees and I developed a relationship with a huge company that had a million moving parts. And it put together something that's now been brought literally millions of dollars into my little public university. I feel very good about that, but I could not have had that happen had I not given myself the position to add that free ranging exploratory aspect into my life. I couldn't do it otherwise, but most people, they're going to need it as an assignment. But thank you guys. This is absolutely terrific.
I think parts of that are like to define job roles far more abstractly. One experience for us is that our contracts, we negotiated them with our dean to essentially be, we could do anything as long as we could justify it to equal a set of teaching credits. And if we couldn't, we just had to fulfill the teaching credit.
Yeah.
But so not to make it about the university, but I think where it's just like you can do anything within some kind of range that's abstractly defined in an ecosystem where if I wasn't doing that part that needs to be done, somebody else could do it. And then it can move around as it needs to. And then we just simply had to justify like our hunch, we're going to go in this direction. But the really important part, I think, that has to happen here too, is that we have to have the autonomy to be able to build the teams, invent the tools, the spaces, the practices, because it's not just an improvement of what exists. Something genuinely new will, in a certain sense, make its own new type of silo, but it needs to be able to do that. We're no longer doing this, and we're allowing it to emerge. So how can it have an organizational legitimacy, right? I would say people who are in leadership need to be able to sense, and they're looking for, and they're like, this isn't just an improvement. There's something novel emerging here. How do we support it as a micro-organizational logic? And how do we keep its difference alive? I think that's a big challenge within an organization. It feels often, I think, like redundancy. Like now we have two of these. Why are we doing that over here and over there? And it's like, no, they're not two of those. This is now has the possibility of going somewhere else.
Yeah.
And if we rationalize it and go like, we don't need 5 of those. Let's just have one of them. We've lost those tendrils. And I think this is the important part. There's always these kind of paradoxes where you have to do a type of both. So for the new to emerge, it has to become, you could say, like a new type of siloed thing. Like it's got a cohesion to it. But the really important part, I think, is that it has to also be entirely transparent so people could, without damaging the difference, they could co-opt any part of it. And this is what you see in evolution, right? Like the bird's evolving to be whatever, but there's like 16,000 creatures living on it or with it or beside it that don't really care about that, but are co-opting the bird in their own ways that are interdependent. So I think it's really important, like you have different approaches to flight emerging, and they don't all have to become one, and they can become distinct and they can defend their difference. No, we're the biplanes or we're the whatever. But at the same time, the wing warpers, they have to be able to co-opt any part of that and bring it to their world. And I think this is the challenge, is that like rebels have to turn into owners of territory that they're defending if something's really going to evolve long enough to be different. And so it's figuring out the mechanisms. And this is the part I'd say is like, it's all the unsexy parts of organizations. Like rewiring HR. Like what do contracts look like? Let's rewrite contracts. But most creativity consultants are coming in and let's do something sexy about the culture and paint the walls orange and whatever it might be, or like have people meet each other or something. And then also do we have the right physical architecture? We have a new building and all the offices for all the faculty, you walk down a hall and it's all glass. And what's really great about this in terms of affordances is that in any time you walk down a hall, you're going anywhere, you see what everyone actually does, whether they're there or not. And you're like, oh, Jason's got this little robot there. Like he must know something about robots. And then like, Greg, why is that there? Right? And so you're starting to catalog non-relevant linkages.
Yep.
But then at some moment, I'm walking down the hall, Greg's in his office and I can see it. But just these kind of subtle changes that we brush against information, we brush against each other. But in our building, for example, there's very few windows. There's no windows really into people's offices. The way the office is organized, they're way out of the way. But that alone has made an impossibility of networking in this building. But the propensity to network is like when you get to another building. And you literally see this like as a ratchet where we collaborate more with other people because we actually run into them because of the way the architecture's set up. And it's not like that they're more creative or we're more creative. It's just like the loops of movement have been shaped really well. And I think these are again, like not sexy things like putting pool tables and bars in co-working spaces, but really this nuanced figuring out like, how do experiments stay in people's way so you run into things? How does all of that is super critical. And so, I mean, this is back to like affordances, the ecological part. That I think we're putting so much more of our energy into things that are sexy and not enough, you could say in a leadership way, into the things that are genuinely configurational. Because I've never met a creativity consultant whose expertise is like contracts. Where they show up and they're like, hey guys, I'm going to go talk to HR and we're going to rework everyone's contract. And it's like, no, we're not looking for that kind of consultant.
Tom, I think we have to say thank you. I think we'd like to keep going. It's been great. Your questions and your contributions and your pushing and your experiences has been.
I'm happy to meet you guys. And there's so much Prometheanism here. Leadership comes in every part of the organization. This ability to innovate is very much close to the passion that we have in terms of rescripting how we think of what leadership means as something that's essentially human and available in every part of every organization, every community. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's really wonderful to talk to everybody from all over, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, let's stay in touch. Let's all stay connected.
You can sign up for our weekly newsletter, which is really great. But we also have our website houses all our previous newsletters, the emergentfutureslab.com. And it also has a really great glossary. We have, like this event, like weekly live events on topics. This has been really wonderful.
Thank you.